everybody, and welcome to this Bible study. We're here with Pastor Sasha Bolotnikov for us to study the book of Ephesians. And we ask you to share this video with anybody who you know needs to hear these words, like, and subscribe to the channel. Thanks again.
So the lesson, to me, like at the beginning, it talks, we see that it talks a lot about children and how the parents are over the children. But in Sunday, Monday, I have some questions about when are the kids old enough to have to stop being parented, It talks about how you're a disciple of your own right, and when you're a kid, you're with all your parents all the time. But when do we start our own journey as like kids, and just when?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Nicholas, because definitely there is a period of early childhood where children fully rely on their parents, of course. But the question, where in the process of our growing, are we grown up enough to actually be responsible for our own behavior and our own decisions? It's a process. However, when we look at, for example, the story of Jesus, this gives us a little clue how it was in the Jewish culture of Jesus' time. So if we can look up the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, and this is the story of how Jesus was lost in the temple. And so we can see, let's start reading verses 41 and 42.
His parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem according to the custom of the feast.
So this is the setting, and it's interesting that Luke is the only biographer that mentions about the childhood and youth years of Jesus, particularly teenage years of Jesus. He's mentioning in the gospel. So this is when he was 12, and so the story goes on and says they kind of lost him for 3 days.
Yeah.
I can imagine, what would be today? There would be already vigils.
Yeah, exactly. Candles, signs.
Correct. But I don't know what was going on when they were looking for him. But as it says here, let's read verse 46 through 49.
It says, "Now, so it was that after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers. So when they saw him, they were amazed. And his mother said to him, 'Son, why have you done this to us? Look, your father and I have sought you anxiously.' And he said to them, 'Why do you seek me? Do you not know that I must be about my father's business?'"
This is a very good example who were these teachers? What do you think?
I always guess they were like inside the temple because they taught.
Yes.
Related
They were rabbis. Correct. They were rabbis. They were not priests, so he wasn't like in a sanctuary by the altar, but he was most likely, there was a place in the temple square, which was called Portico of Solomon. And he was there, and they had a big synagogue there. And so at the age of 12, he made decision to go study scripture, and he made it on his own. And so basically, he said, it's like the mother, of course, Mary is his mother, and she says, "Well, me and the father," whom is she referring to?
Joseph.
Joseph.
And who was Joseph to Jesus?
Well, he's earthly father.
Yeah,
Foster
the one who
father.
Yeah,
raised
foster
him. Yes.
father.
Yeah, foster father. But Jesus is kind of making this statement, well, I am at my father's business.
Yeah.
You see? So here we have a very specific words and very specific choices that a child, 12-year-old, does. And it's not accidental because in Jewish tradition, I don't know if you ever heard of bar mitzvah.
I've heard of them. Are they like quinceañeras or something like that?
Maybe, I don't know. But bar mitzvah, bar in Aramaic means son, and mitzvah means commandments. So they have also today bat mitzvah, which means daughter of commandments. So it's the time when a child is no longer a child, and he or she is having a personal responsibility for living a godly life. And in Jewish culture, it is usually determined around the age of 13.
Oh.
And so Jesus was 12 and a half, and so he came to study for his bar mitzvah.
Okay, sweet.
That's interesting.
So basically, very interesting what they do in a ceremony, and maybe somebody in our church maybe turned 13 and we can do it. So this time, young man, young woman prepare some little sermonette, her reflection on the Bible, and one of the traditional Jewish prayers is the father comes and says to the Lord God, I am grateful for giving me this child and for the fact that this child has grown enough that I do not have responsibility for
Interesting. Interesting.
So basically, the Jewish understanding is that, after 13, parents do not carry responsibility over, so God is not holding parents responsible. So the parents are responsible to bring the child to that kind of age, and then basically it's his or her decisions, right or wrong.
Right. Okay, that's a good answer, honestly. I know, because I remember reading of that children, meaning of what they used to call it, but it involved kids from being born to 60. So
yes, sometimes they refer if we look, the ages are very different. For example, if we look at the law in the book of Deuteronomy, which is kind of an interesting situation here, let's read Deuteronomy 21, verse 18 through 20.
If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and who, when they have chastened him, will not heed them, then his father and his mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his city, to the gate of his city. And they shall say to the elders of the city, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard.
You see, this is not a little child.
right.
Then they stone him to death. It's not a little child. But this is basically a case of elderly abuse.
At that point, yeah.
So at this particular point, so the context in the Bible is very important. So this is not about parents taking a kid who is disobedient and they go take him to the court and stone him, because that until we read verse 20, the glut and drunkard, we realize, boy, this is a already grown up fellow who is probably beating up on his parents. And that's why they have no choice. He's drunk.
It's out of their hands at that point, especially he was not heeding instruction, and they've done what they could.
Yes. So what they done before, like chastised and stuff when he was child. But nevertheless, he grew up and he was starting making this decision and became a drunkard.
Something I wanted to ask about the respect for parents and obeying them. We know the fifth commandment, and we know that honoring your parents is something that it has a promise in the Bible. But where do we draw the line? Like, what if you have parents that are abusive and they ask you to do things that are not right to God? Or like honoring them and obeying them, is that the same thing?
Well, first of all, let's read our text in Ephesians, because there is this balance here, which we can see. Ephesians 6, verses 1 through 4. And it provides us a very balanced approach, parents, children, how it really works.
Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and your mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. And you, fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord.
So when you're referring to abuse, that verse 4 is extremely important, because basically, today we say it abuse, but basically when we look at the particular Greek verb which is used there, parorgidzo. Parorgidzo is do not make intentional confrontation. So basically, and it happens very often, parents punish kids out of anger. So they lash out, they project
their emotions on them.
Emotions, which is that's the part which what it refers in verse 4. But when it comes to verse 1, there is another important Greek word, which is, as you read, obey, but it's very interesting. It says, hypoakuo, so take heed, listen. So be listening. So it's not like there are other Greek words that are used to say like obedience, but it's not like absolutely, absolutely
without a doubt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's basically the idea here in hypoakuo is to it's the same as. For example, when God said to Abraham, listen to the voice of your wife, Sarah. Mm-hmm. So this is more from
to consider, just to...
From the position of respect.
Oh, consideration.
Yeah, from the position of respect. So that's what it basically projects. But as for the commandment, there is also very interesting how Jesus interprets the fifth commandment about honoring the father and the mother, and that's basically the idea of honoring, respect. It doesn't include absolute submission under any circumstances. Okay. But this is what Jesus refers to when he's talking about the fifth commandment. Let's read Mark 7, verses 10 through 12.
For Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say, if a man says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might receive from me is Corban, that is a gift to God, then you no longer let him do anything for his father or his mother.
So what kind of children are we talking about here, and what kind of parents do you think? What the age is here? Is it talking here about little kids?
As an adult, somebody that can work.
Yes, somebody. Well, back in the old days, there was no retirement or any kind of stuff. So let's say parents, or okay, let's say a father has a business. And so eventually he gets old and he turns the business to his son. What is expected in, you as a son, you pay and support your father because he built this business and he turned it to you. Now he expects. And what he does basically, and this was kind of a legal thing that was permitted, that he would say, oh, all my business is dedicated to the Lord. So as a result,
He didn't have to give to.
he doesn't have to pay out.
Oh.
So that's why it says in the fifth commandment that your days would be prolonged. It's connected because what does it mean, prolonged days? When somebody is old enough that he can or she cannot work, the pension or retirement, money, support, all this prolongs the days. So it says, okay, if you do not support your parents,
You won't be supported by
your
God.
children will not. So this is,
I see.
yeah. So there is definitely a limit here in the commandment to the extent how are we supposed to honor the father and mother. What it actually
Takes from.
yeah. What it actually takes. I remember a long time ago, there was one family. I mean, she was a single mother, and her daughter was baptized. She was the gal was probably maybe 15, but her mother continued coming to church and would not would not get baptized. And we learned that she doesn't do it because her mother, the grandma, her mother, said to her, you were born to Orthodox Christian faith. If you betray your faith, I will curse you.
Oh.
So because she was listening and obedient to the mother, she became more obedient to the mother than to God. And it happened a lot because sometimes that's why I like, Nicholas, when you ask first, where is the age limit?
Yeah,
One of the worst situations happens when a person is in his 20s, 30s, and it happens sometimes when, especially someone is raised by a single mother. This single mother basically poured out her heart in the child. The husband is not in the picture, and so she lives for the child. And then she raises that child to the point that in any kind of circumstances, he's dependent. The child or she's dependent. The child, 25, he's still dependent. Oh, mother said.
True.
And when this person marries,
they're dependent now. Like they're still kind of dependent on their mother.
Yeah,
sometimes.
yeah, exactly.
And actually, that I feel like that happens on like Hispanic culture with grandparents and like grandmothers, because sometimes the parents are so busy they like leave the kid all the time with like their grandparents.
Yeah.
And there's this saying, and like that Mexicans have, that is sometimes like if you were born and raised by your grandparents, you're like not gonna be as useful as you could be. Because I think it's the same, because they pour their heart out and they try to do all the good things for you. But inside those good things, the limitations they mark for you to grow are a lot more.
And the rule here is Genesis 2:24. Now that's a really, really serious principle.
Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and join to his wife, and they shall become one flesh, and they were born naked in the man and his wife.
So the marriage, that's when you leave mother and father. Doesn't matter, man or woman.
Yeah, right.
So that's where the limit is. But the commandment is not, it's not like, okay, in the marriage, the mother said, "Oh, I'm listening to what my mother said." No way. This is not how we observe fifth commandment. The fifth commandment is, what do we do when our mother is old? What do we do? How do we take care? Make sure, that we care when they can. They cared for us in the childhood. We care for our parents but it's not like they're not to tell us what to do, especially when we're married.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Consideration, is a key, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely.
Okay, so then I kind of want to touch on those verses as well, that it's almost obvious that a kid should listen to their parent. When we're talking especially about the limitations that we're talking about the limitation that you had mentioned, like with the age and things like that. And if we're looking at the median here, if we're looking at the average household where, there is that respect and there is that desire to want to do right by your parents, is that not the average? Is that not to be expected? And what's going on at the time that Paul feels provoked to make these instructions?
Basically, in the context here, Paul is giving a pastoral teaching. So he starts with, the lifestyle. First, chapter 4, the second half of chapter 4 transitions to the second part of epistles to Ephesians, which is basically from theological part, which is first 3.5 chapters, to a pastoral part. And so we get all kinds of this ethical teachings, and one of the from the lifestyle of, don't get drunk in a bar, but go to the church service, to the relationships between husbands and wives and the relationships in the family. And we have here about wives, about husbands, and it's always on balance. Wives respect, the husband must love, and that's what we discussed in the previous lessons. And then, of course, he gets into children. So there's a whole family section. And the reason for it, because he's addressing the Ephesians, and I keep repeating this, motive of Ephesians, because here are these Christians of Ephesus who left their pagan background. They stopped being idol worshippers. And in the pagan families, everything was completely messed up. Everything was messed up. And so basically, Paul is setting up here a basic for relationships in a Christian families. Relationship, husband's wife, relationship, children, parents. So this is the section where we are from chapter 5, verse 22 through chapter 6, verse 4. This is basically about the dynamics in the family.
So is this like the turning point for the people of Ephesus, or had they already made the transition and he's kind of just reassuring them?
Yeah, basically, when this Ephesian former pagan steps into the Christian community, which Paul created, and becomes part of this community, he needs to live by the principles of Jesus. And that's what basically Paul is communicating to them on the practical level. Because on the theoretical level, I used to believe in many gods. I used to engage in some kind of philosophical debates, but I don't want it anymore. Now I accept God of heaven and earth, God of creation, God creator, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so now this is basically a higher theory. But what about the practical life? How do I change my family dynamics? And today, I hear a lot, like many testimonies of people, like how that they had to, how they changed their family dynamics. It's so, especially it's very touching for me when I hear the testimony of a person, of a family whose husband, a woman, her husband was alcoholic, so he was selling everything in the house to support his habit or his addiction. He was like beating up on his wife, beating up on his children. As soon as they see their father coming drunk, they try to run away, hide, because it was just impossible. The life was just unbearable. And then suddenly this man got very, very sick with cirrhosis of liver or even cancer. Tumor was there because he was experiencing extreme pain. And because he was such an alcoholic, no pain medication, not even morphine could affect him. And it looked like he was just dying. And on his, literally, he was at the hospital screaming because of the pain, and he screamed something like this: Lord, if you exist, and you take away my pain, no matter how long I live, I will give my heart to you, and I will repent, and I will serve you as long as I live. God responded to his scream. The pain stopped, and he was able to continue living. Wow. His life turned around. He went to church. He became a deacon. And so it was interesting to hear the testimony of his wife and children. They've never seen father like this. He was a different man. They had to learn a different dynamics, So before it was just for kids, it was just a sort of fear, when is the father gonna hit me for whatever? And now it was to learn a difference. It's like someone who had traumatic injury is learning back to walk. So these Ephesians, from the Gentile background, they're coming, they have to learn, live different lives.
I have a couple of questions now based on the verse in 1 Corinthians 7, 20 through 24. Let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. Were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can be made free, rather use it. For he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freed man. Likewise, who is called while free is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brethren, let each one remain with God in that state in which he was called. So it's that last part, remain in that state in which he was called. So does that not want to encourage progression? Are we supposed to be so humbled to the point where it's not important for us to seek better for ourselves? I mean, it says that if you are able to be free, then take that opportunity, but I'm not sure how that translates. So if you're in the middle class, to stay in the middle class, what is it really trying to say, and how does that relate to the other verses that we had read previously? Because it doesn't really seem like it fits.
It's a very interesting passage here because it's actually started with verses 18, where it's talking about, if you can read it, verse 18 and 19.
Was anyone called while circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Was anyone called while uncircumcised? let him not be circumcised.
This is kind of an interesting why I wanted you to read the previous two verses because what is Paul discussing here are different situations. It's called your status in life. Of course, when somebody is when it's referred to being circumcised, it's like, are you Jewish? Mm-hmm. And if you're not Jewish, this is not a problem because the most important is to live in by God's commandments. In my personal experience, I saw some people who have some kind of inferiority complex that they're not Jewish. There are many teachings now and ideas going around. For example, I encountered this group which they call themselves Hebrew Israelites. And they try to prove that they are the true Jews and it belongs to them. And some of them even I watched some videos in Toronto, let's say a Hasidic Jew walks on the street and I observe some Jamaican fellow comes at him and says, you know, I am the Jew, you are not Jewish, and so forth. But it comes from this kind of inferiority complex. There are many people today especially in the West, with this DNA tests. I met a few people who learned about through the DNA that they have like 10% Ashkenazic Jewish genes in them, and they get so hyped up about their identity and I was raised in the wrong identity. I was raised Catholic and my mother is hiding me that somewhere I was Jewish. So these people this is the question of personal satisfaction. Many people today are not satisfied with their names. Well, this is possible to change. Easy. What about someone who is not satisfied with their gender? That can be very consequential. Especially, it's very easy to make a surgery, but is it gonna change what's inside this pain, the depression? The study shows not really. Yeah. It doesn't help. This is why this text is very important. It's not about striving for success. It's not about the apathy. It's about personal peace in your heart. As it says here in verse 21, if you can become free, use it. Although, when we talk about slavery, we have to realize that, when we look at the Old Testament and the picture of slavery there is totally different than the picture of slavery in the Roman society. Right. When we look at Exodus chapter 21, we have the very first law about slavery in verse 2 and 3.
If you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free and pay nothing. If he comes in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him.
Yeah, later in Leviticus 24, it's talking about how someone can buy a Hebrew slave. It's basically someone got poor or bankrupt, and it's basically what is called it's nowhere near like what happened in
the New Testament,
either in the New Testament or more so in 19th century Americas, but it's rather indentured servitude. So You bankrupt, you have no money. Okay,
have to work for it.
Yeah, somebody bought your debts, maybe a penny on the dollar, and you go for 6 years. But look at what happens in chapter 5. In chapter 21, verse 5 and 6, the same chapter, verses 5 and 6.
But if the servant plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to the judges. He shall also bring him to the door, or to the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever.
Yeah, so it happened that sometimes this person feels he's
good. He likes it. He doesn't mind. If he's being treated well, maybe when I read this a long time ago, I thought maybe the master's rich, and maybe they're living a good life, and he gets treated well. They eat well. He likes his job. And I don't know.
Yeah,
He likes his job.
But basically, sometimes it happens. And let's put it this way, Semitic slaves. So when we're talking about this phenomena which we describe, we're talking about Semitic tribes, Hebrews, the Arabs, and the Midianites. The reason for it is because we compare now, for example, the American slavery. And American slavery, it was absolutely cruel system because all they needed the strong people who can work plantations. And they didn't care if they die, sugar is the money. That was the culture of 17, 18, 19th century. Unfortunate culture. But over there, it's a totally different world. It's a world of cattle herders. So you take somebody who works for you, he's your slave. In some context, if he says, I'm a slave on such and such, I'm under protection. And so it's not like he's working on a plantation, I watched this movie, which is very good and very educational, gut wrench, 12 years of slavery. And so that's how it's portrayed. But it's like, here's a flock of 200 sheep, and you go with it over there, maybe 30 miles. So this is, and they refer to these people as slaves. So definitely with such attitude.
Way different context.
It's absolutely different. For example,
just hanging out with sheep.
Yeah, it sounds almost relaxing. Yeah, no wonder he wants to stay.
Yes. So take a look, for example, how it's described. Go to Leviticus chapter 25, verses 39 through 43.
And if one of your brethren who dwells by you becomes poor and sells himself to you, you shall not compel him to serve as a slave. As a hired servant and a sojourner, he shall be with you and shall serve you until the year of Jubilee. And then he shall depart from you, and his children with him, and he shall return to his own family. He shall return to the possession of his fathers.
And verse 42 and 43.
For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. You shall not rule over him with rigor, but you shall fear your God.
So this is the attitude of slaves. So when we look, not only among the Israelites, there was such an attitude, but someone like Joseph.
Oh, yeah.
And he was sold as a slave. So it's a different situation. It's not like here it's described somebody got poor and
they have to work for it.
Yeah, that's just indentured servitude, how to help out of poverty. And there are many people whom God just didn't give this talent to be able to be financially independent. And sometimes we have these people constantly struggling.
In debt or...
Yeah, in debt. And that's why maybe some people would feel like, okay, I love my master.
I'd rather just stay here.
He treats me well.
Yeah, it's like having a boss. I think some of the parts of the lesson, they talk about like, you know how you work for some people, so they're serving you technically, but that doesn't make them your slaves.
Yes, exactly. And that's why it says don't rule over them with cruelty. Yeah, but Joseph is a very good example of this because he was the boss.
He was,
and
a slave.
His master trusted him in everything. But when we get to Roman slavery, it's different.
Yeah, and in Roman slavery, I get reminded when I was reading the lesson, I was like, Philemon, you know, when the Paul sends the letter to Philemon, and how his slave Anonymous, he like ran away, and how like in all the lesson, it reminded me of Philemon so much because of what like the setting was for this letter, and it's just crazy to me. It's just crazy to me that this happened, because then Paul talks to Philemon about it, and then he tries to make them like, hey, your brother, like from the same church, but like that was crazy. I'm guessing in that setting where everyone had like their their ranks, you know, or like you're a slave and I'm a master, but now Paul brings them to the equal ground, and like everyone is equal under the cross. And
this is a very good point, Nicholas, because this is why Paul addresses the situation, because sometimes you have, when a slave, you know, and when we talk about the slave, so going to the Roman Empire, it's again, this is status. A free man or a slave?
There's like levels here. You're over here, you're over here.
Yeah, and that's your legal status. So the court system, the justice system considers you either way or. And the problem is Christianity is not teaching to, you know, go do the revolution. And this is why Paul's tone is very, very balanced here. He says in 1 Corinthians, well, if you have a chance to be free, use it. But suppose if you don't, the Lord can give you strength and can give you motivation, because if there is nothing, there are situations where you cannot control. Because if you can't become free, then just
serve what.
Yeah, do whatever you can, because depression, suicidal thoughts, they're not going to help. They're not going to help. So this is why in 1 Corinthians, Paul has such a balanced approach.
So I'm brought to another question when I'm reading 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 1. Let as many bondservants as are under the yoke count their own masters worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and his doctrine may not be blasphemed. And those who have believing masters, let them not despise them because they are brethren, but rather serve them, because those who are benefited are believers and beloved. Teach and exhort these things. So it's talking about being under the yoke of slavery. So we're seeing an imagery of how slavery is depicted properly, and then we have an image of how slavery is being performed improperly. So the fact that Paul has to come in and reestablish these boundaries, are his verses the solution to the dysfunction? But if he's not here to fix it, then what eventually became their solution?
It's interesting because Paul cannot fix Roman Empire. His mission is not to fix the society. there were many rebellions of slaves, such as the most famous was rebellion of Spartacus, and it was very brutal. Then those who survived after multiple battles with Roman army were crucified and cruelly executed. So basically,
He knew. He knew the setting of it.
yeah, this Christianity is not about this. And again, Paul brings the balance because for Paul, what's important is, here is both classes of people in the church. And as you, Nicholas, pointed out, they're equal in the eyes of the Lord.
Yeah, and for me, like when I was reading, like it just reminds me so much of that letter, especially on how Paul addresses him as being almost as his son, like for the slave Anonymous, like almost as his son, but also that he shared the gospel with them both. He was like the connection between the servant and the master. But then he just puts them on the same ground.
Yes, this is a very important Christian principle. It's very interesting that in the history of Seventh-day Adventist Church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church was formed as an official church denomination in 1863, right in the heights of the Civil War. Adventists, Seventh-day Adventists, were very strong abolitionists, and that's why they had problems preaching the gospel in the South. That's why Michigan and the New England states, the Iowa, that's where Adventism was spreading. At the end of the Civil War, Edson White, the son of Ellen White, was able to raise money for a steamboat, and they steamed down the Mississippi River. And the first people whom they were wanting to reach with the Gospels were the former slaves, and they tried to fill the needs, teaching them write and read, literacy school. And yes, it was, Adventists back then were seriously persecuted in the South.
Because they wanted to let them free, I guess. Or
For doing that.
telling them, for teaching them.
Yes, and that is unfortunate because what we see is when we look at the states of our country, the southern states historically been the Bible Belt. So back in those years, in 1800s, unfortunately, Christian teaching was not taking this into consideration, and treating people in different statuses, and of course, again, as I say, what happened in the Americas, not only in North America but in South, the status of slave also depended on the race, which did not exist even in the Roman Empire, which, the devil worked it even worse. And that's what made many people who believed they were Christians, they were plantation owners, whatever, slave owners, they were not taking these verses properly and did not understand that doesn't matter what your race, what your social status is, in the eyes of the Lord, you are absolutely the same. That's why the letter to Philemon is definitely demonstrating this. On the other hand, there's a limit to what God makes us do in the preaching of the gospel. Only He, at His second coming, will make the world totally free and totally just and totally verdant society. We as a human beings, we're sinful and our sinfulness projects into the way how we have the society structure, and changing the society structure by our human efforts will never succeed. And my personal experience is we were taught when I was at school that, well, the communism will make absolutely free, just, and verdant society. In reality, everybody now knows what a communism is, to see if it is a free and just society. Go and look at North Korea, for example.
Yeah.
That's the pinnacle of communism. But this is the reality. Communist ideology is based on, we build a new free world. Well, without God, if you try to do this, you're going to get to the state of North Korea.
I find it interesting that slavery is used to describe a slave to sin, but then there's a context where we're called to be slaves to God. So then when those words are being translated to English, is there a difference when they're written in their original language?
Basically, Hebrew has one word, like eved, and when we talk about this root, it deals more about the service. So that's why you have to see in a context. What is it talking about? So in Roman society, when Paul is using the Greek word doulos, which is eved, and it's talking about under the yoke, and then it's talking about the master. Of course, then we realize it's in the context of Roman society. So, but in English, of course, you have slave. By slave, of course, we understand a type of person who is just a personal property of another individual. And then, but there is also service, indentured service, and all different words. But in the Bible, it's just one word, be it Greek or be it a Hebrew. And so we need a context, and that's why we need to understand the historical context, what was the culture of that time, and how do we translate the culture of that time into the culture of today. And that's very important because there are some scholars who teach, the Bible is culturally conditioned. So not everything in the Bible we should actually apply and follow. And so people who are proponents of this theory, which is, of course, kind of an interesting theory, who will determine what do we follow and what do we not follow? What is culturally conditioned and what is not? It's basically very subjective. It depends on individual who interprets the Bible, and everybody will have its own personal interpretation. That's why I do not subscribe to this idea, the biblical message is culturally conditioned.
Right.
So I would rather say, like a famous scholar back a few years ago told me, William Shea, he said, yes, the Bible is written in the culture of that time, but its message transverses all generation and applicable to our time. So those people who believe, Bible is culturally conditioned, the biblical message is culturally conditioned, those people are saying, okay, since the biblical message is culturally conditioned, see what the situation with slavery. And indeed, Adventists were strongly against slavery when it was going on in America. But it's way different what the Bible describes, especially when it comes to Exodus 21 and those chapters. So we need to really understand the historical context to see, okay, that particular shepherd was a slave, Eliezer was a slave of Abraham. Yeah, but he wasn't the same condition as a slave in Roman Empire.
Right. So it's more about context than it is the culture.
Yes.
And it reminded me on Titus chapter 2 when they talk about like servants, going back to like being like exhorted to be obedient to their own masters. It says, to be well pleasing in all things, do not answer back, not pilfering, but showing good fidelity, that they adorn the doctrines of our God, our Savior. So it's kind of like telling everyone, like, if you're if you're a slave, but if you have God in your heart, you are gonna reflect that. So, like, in all honesty, well, even if you're in a bad condition, you can still be shining like God, like Jesus sharing.
Yes, even though today we probably in most of societies in the world today, we don't have people who can be like considered in the status of a slave, but these verses especially were applicable to the people who were imprisoned, because it's basically the same. For example, I heard many stories of believers and pastors back, in 1930s, 1950s, whatever, and they were, in the Soviet Union during the Stalin time, they were arrested and imprisoned in the labor camps known as Gulag. And so there were many testimonies of people how they were able to mend a good relationship with with the prison guards and with police and all this without compromising their principles of faith.
So we talked about a lot of what is required of a slave, but I wanted to know, after Paul delivers this message and after the master has come to Christ, was it common practice for them to release their slaves, or was it unnecessary?
It depends on circumstances. We know that some masters did release their slaves, but maybe there were other circumstances when it wasn't possible for any reasons. And so that's why Paul is talking about building good relationship between masters and slave.
Yeah, I'm guessing if they have like businesses that depend on the slaves, like if like kind of like a hotel or something like that, and they needed the slaves to be like the maids or servants, like serving the food or cleaning the rooms, or if they just stop working, then let free everyone.
In my opinion, sometimes what happens is basically that former slave or freed slave would not have protection.
Oh.
So what could happen sometimes in the case of maybe a war situation or any kind of civil unrest, it was better for people to be slaves to this master than if this master give them freedom and then something happened and the war happened and somebody would come and abduct them and made them slaves again.
Yeah. That makes sense. Okay.
So that sometimes could happen.
Wow.
Okay. Of course, definitely want to avoid that. And so there are times where we are described as slaves to sin, but then when we are slaves to a master, that's acceptable. So I want to know, where do you kind of establish when it's okay to be a slave, and it's always going to be a slave to sin or a slave to Christ. But then I want to know, how are these words received in Ephesians? Because this is a similar gospel that was preached, as you said, in the Americas and the Bible Belt, the South, things like that. They didn't really take it well. I'm curious on how the Ephesians took it, and also, is this not Was this for the slaves or was it for the masters? I understand that this was preached to everybody, but it can be misinterpreted, especially when you're receiving it as a slave. It kind of feels like somebody's using your circumstance to, like, for the sake of the gospel. And I feel like it can hurt more than it would help, depending on, again, the context.
Yes. One important message that Paul provides across his different epistles, and we were reading Ephesians chapter 6, where it talks about slaves, obey their masters. And again, you have this balance. When we read like going back to Ephesians chapter 6, we have verses 5 and 6.
Bondservants, be obedient to those who are your masters, according to the flesh, with fear and trembling in sincerity of heart, as to Christ, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart.
And then there's a balancing, there's going to be always a balancing statement. Verse 9.
And you, masters, do the same things to them, giving up threatening, knowing that your own master also is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him.
Yes, so basically this text is addressing the issue of the masters, but also in the context throughout his corpus of epistles, Paul is very clear. In the eyes of the Lord, there is neither free nor slave. In the eyes of the Lord, it doesn't exist. In this society, under these particular circumstances, maybe back then it wasn't possible to change, because we have to remember Christianity is to change the heart, not to change the society. God controls the history. The same way as Daniel became a slave to the Babylonian court, he was, a captive. So we have this history of Joseph, history of Daniel. The Bible is not teaches us that we don't have control over society, but we have control of our hearts. And so Paul separates the worldly situation. And he says, well, in the worldly situation, back in the Roman Empire, you could be this way. Mm-hmm. But in the situation of spiritual, then definitely we either servants to Jesus or slaves to Satan. Mm. And absolutely obvious that when we give our lives to Jesus, Jesus treats us as a servants, and also as our children. At the same time, there are many sides of it. But if we submit to Satan, he's going to definitely use us, abuse us, and treat us as a slave. As a slave. So that's in the spiritual realm.
Right. Thank you so much, Pastor Sasha. And thank you all for watching this deep dive into Ephesians. If you like what you see, then please like the video, share it with your friends, your family, and your social media, and subscribe to the channel. Also clicking that bell to not miss the next video. Thanks, everyone.